Well, ladies and gentlemen, now it is time for our next tech talk, which is on shifting to a proactive intelligence response. Well, the cyber threat intelligence, which is CTI, presents various opportunities for security functions with ambitions to establish a proactive response against adversaries. While long associated with indicators of compromise, CTI can also be used to identify high leverage security controls and hone detection efforts. This talk will outline various proactive CTI use cases, including threat hunting, utilizing YARA rules, and leveraging the MITRE, ATT, and CK framework. Well, we're joined by our speaker, Jamie Collier, the Cyber Threat Intelligence Consultant, FireEye, United Kingdom. Jamie has completed a PhD in cybersecurity at the University of Oxford, where he remains active as a research affiliate with the Center for Technology and Global Affairs. Well, with this, it is now time to call upon Jamie to join us on the stage and screen. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be speaking at the World Cybersecurity Summit in Qatar. Unfortunately, virtually for the time being, but very much hope to be able to resume physical conferences in the near future. My name's Jamie Collier. I work as a cyber threat intelligence consultant at Mandiant. I spend my time working directly with organizations to help them understand their threat landscape and their use of threat intelligence. So really helping them to better utilize threat intelligence. And what I'm going to be speaking about here today is how organizations can really maximize the use of threat intelligence by being more proactive with that insight into the threat landscape and moving from that perhaps a reactive posture to one that is much more proactive indeed. So really want to be focusing on proactive threat intelligence. But before I do, I want to just really zoom out and talk about threat intelligence more broadly. Why are we here? Why are we having a conversation around threat intelligence in the first place? So I talk about threat intelligence as 3 steps. So first of all, it's about identifying relevant threats. So that might be threats that we've previously seen on our network. It might be active threats within a certain sector or geography. But then I think it's really critical to move beyond just identifying relevant threats to actually taking action. So inserting security controls against those techniques that are really active, maybe patching vulnerabilities that we know are being exploited by relevant threat actors, for instance. And I think the more we can focus on that, the more we can focus on actually taking action off the back of those relevant threats, the more we're going to benefit from threat intelligence. And if we can do that, if we can take those actions, then we're in a really exciting place where we're actually improving security outcomes. So I think in that regard, it's really important that threat intelligence isn't just interesting analysis for the sake of interesting analysis. It's not just reports for the sake of reports, but it's actually really directly connected to improving those broader security outcomes, and that it's connected to the overarching mission of whether that be a security function or even the organization as a whole. And as I said, a lot of organizations interested in moving beyond just a reactive approach to threat intelligence. So what I'm talking about here is a predominantly indicator-led approach. So taking indicators of compromise based on, say, emails, malicious domains, malware variants, etc., and using those indicators to create blocks or alerts that will go to, say, a security analyst, a security operations center, to provide that visibility towards potentially malicious activity on a network. Now, these indicators of compromise absolutely have a place. It can be a really useful tool for creating these blocks and alerts. But I think we also need to be honest about the limitations of a purely indicator-led approach. And there's maybe 2 that I want to pick out in particular. So I think the first is that actually a lot of threat actors can quite easily get around a purely indicator-led approach. By changing just a few strings, changing up, say, registering a new domain, can actually get beyond a lot of these controls or a lot of these kind of efforts. You're really relying on threat actors reusing infrastructure for this approach to be successful. And then I think the second thing is actually we've got to be really pragmatic and realistic about what's going on within many security functions and security operations centers. And often we find actually that it can set up all these blocks and all these alerts, But what if a security analyst is then getting overwhelmed with false positives? What if they're getting so many alerts a day that they can't actually meaningfully investigate them? So I think being really realistic, being honest about the fact that a lot of security teams are stretched, or they're at least operating in resource-constrained environments where there needs to be that pragmatism, I think that's all really important. So we can contrast that with a more proactive response. Here we're much more focused on attacker techniques and the broader modus operandi of those different threats. We can look across the entire attack lifecycle, so really interested in how threat actors are moving within a network, escalating privileges, for example. We can also leverage YARA rules. So this is a way of identifying malware, perhaps an alternative to that indicator-led approach. And what we're doing here is creating rules that look for certain characteristics, perhaps certain strings within a malware variant, for instance. This could be really flexible. It can be used for really precise, honed-in threat hunting missions that are targeted, or as, say, part of a broader detection effort. So I think it's really versatile, but I think critically it gets beyond some of the limitations of that reactive approach. We also want to make sure, if we're being proactive, that we're integrating threat intelligence with other components of a security function. So having, for example, a red team or a threat hunt mission that is intelligence-led, that's using that insight on what we actually see in a threat landscape, in a sector, in a geography, to inform the sort of threats that we're looking out for instance. Also making sure that the relevant security controls are then validated by using intelligence of what threat actors are actually doing in the wild, as it were. So want to talk about this in various ways, but I think often when we think of proactive responses to threat intelligence and we start talking about entire attack lifecycle, attack techniques, the Miti Attack framework often comes to mind. So what you're looking at here is the Miti Attack framework. This is effectively, for those not familiar, an index of different attacker techniques. So all the different ways that threats might pose, a threat or a risk to your network. What are the different sort of attack vectors that they might deploy? And I think looking at a list like this, it's certainly easy to get overwhelmed. We can just see that there are so many different ways that threats might go after us. And it can be difficult in such a situation to prioritize. And we could certainly imagine a situation where an organization invests in security controls, in detection efforts on some of these areas circled on green. And they might have really good security controls. They might have made it actually really difficult for attackers to compromise these specific areas circled in green. But what if the most relevant threats, the threats that are most likely to target that organization and the network, use the attacker techniques that are actually circled in red? Despite all of that investment in those areas in green, not actually meaningfully improved security in any tangible way, because you're focusing on the wrong areas. So I think what Miti Attack does is allows us to understand, well, what are those attacker techniques that are really actively used that I should be concerned about? And then we can focus on those to make sure that we're really maximizing our investments and our focus within security. And I think the key with Miti is that there's actually different ways that it can be used. There's different stakeholders that might look at Miti for different things. So I want to get into this. But really the starting point for Miti Attack is mapping. So this could be mapping against malware variants or threat actors. Within Mandiant Advantage, our threat intelligence portal, we actually provide mapping for both. And what this does is effectively provides a list of attacker techniques that we know are associated with different threat actors, different malware variants. And I think that's a good first step. It's increasingly a standard, I think, within threat intelligence to have this sort of insight. But when I look at these sorts of maps, I think that certainly useful. If we're worried about a specific threat actor, we can start to build out understanding, we can start to do something with this insight and focus on some of these attack techniques. But I also think we can do so much better by thinking about Miti in different ways. So I'll give you a few examples in the next few slides. But I think the first is looking not just at attacker techniques, but also more technical or tactical attributes as well. As you can see here, looking at, say, a ransomware group, looking at attacker techniques, but linking that to some of those attributes. So what are the file paths, the files, the file names being used by this group in their operations? If they're escalating privileges, how exactly are they doing that? What processes are they executing? What do those processes look like? And I think this additional layer of insight, this insight into specific attacker attributes, that allows us to be much more proactive. So we're not just thinking about security controls now. We can be really focused on, say, detection efforts lined up to specific file names, for instance. We can be really out the blocks with that detection, with the security controls, with threat hunting missions as well. So we can proactively go looking for threats in case they're already on our network, rather than waiting to find out about them when we've, say, experienced a ransomware attack and all our systems are encrypted. So that might be perhaps a more operational use case relevant to those thinking about detection or those thinking about threat hunting. But I think MITRE also has perhaps underestimated potential for executives and for strategic stakeholders. So what strategic stakeholders might want to look at is a kind of a more macro perspective. So what are the attacker techniques that we see happening all the time? And you can see in our latest M-Trends report, which is free to download on our website, what we do is we go back through the previous year and we look at all of the different malicious activity that we've seen. And we actually provide percentages on some of the most prominent attacker techniques. So what you can see here on the right-hand side is all the different ways that threat actors have gained initial access to organizations in their attacks. And I think what becomes immediately obvious is actually that there are a handful of attacker techniques, such as exploiting public-facing applications, phishing, using valid accounts. There's a handful of these techniques that are used in the vast majority of malicious operations. So I think translating that to a strategic audience and executive audience, the message here is actually that there is probably also a small handful of security controls or training programs. And if we can get those right, if we can get security controls and detection efforts focused on some of these attack techniques that occur all of the time, then we can actually very quickly wipe out significant proportions or significant portions of our attack surface. So this is what I call a high leverage security control or a high leverage security decision. If we make a few of these decisions, we can actually have a huge and disproportional impact in reducing our digital risk. So I think that's really significant. Now, what you're looking at on this page, as I said, from our M-Trends report, it's that global perspective. It's out of all of the different attack techniques that we've seen. I think a strategic audience and even an operational audience, in fact, can combine this with a more sector or regional approach. So we could actually build up heat maps that would look at attack techniques that we see used by different threat actors. So we might, for instance, be interested in, well, what are the active techniques that we see within the banking sector or the government sector? What are the techniques that are cropping up within the Middle East or even within Qatar specifically? So what we could do, again, this is something available on our Mandiant Advantage platform, is look at all the different threat actors that we've seen target a certain geography, a certain sector, and actually combine all those different mappings and provide a number of, say, if we've seen 40 threat actors target a certain sector, it might be that 35 of those actors have conducted the same sort of attacker techniques. So again, it's identifying these high leverage attacker techniques and by extension, the security controls that could be used to mitigate them. Now, a few other ideas on how we can be proactive in our use of intelligence. I think one thing is intelligence-led red teaming. So it's all well and good getting a red team in to compromise an organization, some interesting techniques and say, provide a report at the end saying, this is how we gained access to your organization. These are the sort of security controls to prevent this happening in the future. But actually, going back to some of the earlier discussion, if those red team engagements and the attacker techniques being used, if they don't really correlate to what attackers are using in practical settings within that threat landscape, it's not really that useful. So I think it's critical that a red team looks at threat intelligence, understands the attacker techniques that are really prominent for a specific organization, and then seeks to conduct those sorts of attacker techniques. Then, if a red team's able to do that, they're actually testing an organization's preparedness, defense, and resilience against meaningful and relevant attacker techniques. So I think that's really important that red teams adopt that intelligence-led approach. And then I think the final thing I want to talk about is security validation. There's a huge amount of excitement within Mandiant around security validation. I think you speak to most of our people, they'd say that this is really where we see the future of the industry heading in the next few years. And what this does is, I think so far I've probably talked about understanding, well, which security controls do we want to prioritize, do we want to identify based on the threat landscape. Security validation takes that a step further by then testing those security controls, by conducting attack emulation that's mapped to real threat activity that we're seeing, recently, and actually conducting similar sort of attacks through an attack emulation platform that's then actually saying, well, are these controls even effective? So there's all different, all sorts of different things that could happen that would throw off a security control. Maybe it's been misconfigured. Maybe we rolled out some update and it's not quite working as it should. So I think threat intelligence, first and foremost, let's identify those security controls. But actually, let's also think about that validation to ensure that those security controls are effective. And I think critically what attack emulation can do is give us that peace of mind. We can look at attack emulation linked to specific threat actors, and we can then say to our executive team, to our security team, look, if these certain threat actors were to target us tomorrow, we would likely be secure because we've run those emulations, or we would likely be compromised, but we know exactly why. We know exactly what security controls have let us down or that need to be reconfigured. So anyway, that's it from me. I've spoken about a few different attack controls and security techniques, different ways to use threat intelligence here today. If this is something that's of interest, we've got a lot of resource, we've got a lot of interest in this within Mandiant Threat Intelligence. So please do get in touch if you're interested in taking the conversation any further. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much